submerged and secured. Water spilled over the captive's lips while the wooden straps bit into wet skin. The survivor gasped against the trough and tried to drag a knee free. Fear pushed each breath into short jerks, and fear drove him to count the rhythm of the pause so he could measure when another dip would come. The torturer kept his hands steady, fingers on a small iron key ring, and the chronicler watched the ledger lamp and did not look up. The narrator records this scene in plain terms: a practice, a protocol, signatures behind the method. The survivor had been brought from a village road, his arms raw where rope had chewed, his shirt a sodden rag tied at the shoulder. He knew the concrete stakes: name comrades or suffer damage that could not be healed, and he knew the ledger would carry whatever he said into other cells and other hands. In the first few minutes, the central problem is clear: survive the procedure without naming names or accept injury that will end any future life of work. The torturer set the trove to the marked level and tested the paw with his wrist. "Bend now," he said. "Lower the shoulder. Name them." The chronicler, voice thin as brush on paper, "Name one." The survivor tried to answer, and his mouth filled with water. He coughed, and the water ran in a steady, black line down the trove stone. The torturer tightened a strap with a practiced twist. The rope barked against skin. A scribe, a ranger, had prepared the sequence before dawn. The torturer referenced a bound sheet of instructions by a clipped sound of metal, and then tapped the ledger to show where the ledger required a seal. The room smelled of wet wood and candle wax. The chronicler's lamp burned low and shaded his ink, stained fingers as if the lamp itself were a measuring device. "What is the charge?" The chronicler, without moving his head, he read the entry aloud to confirm the form: "Conspiracy to subvert order." "Conspiracy," the torturer repeated. He tilted his head, then poured another measured stream. He had been trained to keep motion bland. He checked the key ring, selected a small iron hook, and clicked it into place on the board beside the trough. The survivor tried to speak through the water. "Not them," he managed. A chain clinked when the torturer secured the strapped knee. He did not look at the survivor's face. He only watched the water and the measure on the rim. His actions made the proceedings factual. This was a sanctioned procedure, not a moment of rage. Outside the cell, guards shuffled paper and shifted their weight. The narrator notes how that detail matters. These were not random men, they acted on orders. The ledger would record the outcome, and those orders would travel upward. The survivor's first emotional move was suspicion at the presence of the ledger seals. Why had signatures suddenly appeared on the page that had been blank yesterday? That suspicion steeped into fear as cold water foamed against his lips. "Tell us one name," the torturer flatly. The survivor swallowed. He counted the pores in his head like a workman counting boards. The chronicler set his brush down and watched the man's chest rise. When the survivor's breath shortened, the torturer slowed the paw for effect, and then quickened again. When the torturer went to fetch the wooden immobilization chest, the room changed its geometry. The chest was narrow, carved with a simple iron hinge, stained where hands had held it. The torturer placed it on the stone and tapped the lid as if checking a seam. The survivor's shoulders slumped with the knowledge of what that box would do to breathing. In the chest, he will be less able to shift. The torturer to the chronicler. "Containment increases the effect of the water." "Write that," the chronicler replied, and his brush left a deliberate black mark. He flipped a sealed sheet and exposed a page with a different ink, new handwriting, the same official stamp. The chronicler hesitated only a moment, then set the lamp closer and began to copy the measure. The survivor's voice grew small. "If I say a name, will you stop?" he asked. "We stop when the ledger is satisfied." The chronicler, "Do you understand the form?" The survivor breathed in shallow gulps. He braced a hand against the trough stone, fingers numb. He could feel the callus on his own palm, a small fact that did not comfort him. The chest proved its cruelty immediately. The torturer forced the survivor inside and set straps. The wood creaked as the lid met the frame, and the survivor's shoulders bowed into a position that made his breathing short and quick. The straps gave no room for recoil. The torturer turned the iron latch, and the sound clicked into the room like a final note. From within the chest, the survivor whispered about the way the water method had been combined with immobilization in other cells. They pressed the chest. Then flooded below the rim, he said. It made the lungs fight for air, and the straps kept the body from turning to cough. The chronicler wrote quickly. Name the moment, he said. Describe the timing. The survivor supplied details. The poor timing, the number of straps, the height of the truss rim, the feel of splinters. He gave exact counts of seconds between pours. He wanted the chronicler to record methodically because he believed the record might be proof one day, or vengeance if someone read it without the seal. The torturer worked with an almost liturgical sequence. He set bowls of water lined at marked heights and tilted kettle spouts with exact angles. He lifted a strip of linen to show how cramps began when damp cloth clung to skin. He did not speak of cruelty. He spoke of effect. Effect is everything, he said. Containment doubles the work. The chronicler paused and cleaned his brush. His job was not to judge the method, but to make it unambiguous. He turned another page and exposed an entry that made the survivor's hands clench against the wood. The new entry bore a second signature and a note in a different hand that ordered extended procedure in case the subject withheld names. That notation altered the survivor's immediate calculus. The pain would not stop at a few pores. The ledger reveal is the first twist. The survivor had assumed these torments were local improvisations. The new signature turned the event into coordinated escalation. The survivor's fear shifted into a cold, practical dread. He now knew refusal would take him past endurance and into permanent harm. The survivor pushed air through clenched teeth. I know them by trade routes. He said, I know where they meet. The torturer leaned to hear and then straightened. Give one name. The chronicler hesitated before dipping his brush. He rubbed his thumb along a smudge on his palm and then wrote the first name. The ink held black and wet. The survivor's voice quivered. When he spoke names, he counted aloud in a broken list. Each name became a recorded fact. After the first name came bargaining. The survivor offered half, truths, locations with one wrong detail, a name with a wrong hometown, not Kaito from the mill, he said quickly. But Kaito who trades near the North Bridge, which Kaito? The chronicler, name, the family, Kaito Sato, the survivor. He the name because he feared the chest would not release him otherwise. The torturer loosened one strap a notch, a small movement of mercy that read as reward for cooperation. The chronicler recorded each correction and added measure notes at the margin. His handwriting grew slanted as the lamp dimmed. The ledger's margins filled with half, phrases and small seals. The ledger now read as both evidence and instruction. The ledger's new signature meant command approval. An external event shifted the room. Footsteps approached at the corridor threshold. A guard halted and passed a folded paper. The chronicler unfolded it, and his face moved only in the small way an old man adjusts glasses. He read a short line, then snapped the paper closed and tucked it beneath the lamp. The paper carried an order to extend the immobilization period if names were incomplete. That paper changed the immediate stakes. The survivor felt that change in the tightening of a strap across his ribs. The survivor's emotion shifted again. What began as fear moved into a brittle resolve to protect certain names. He chose not to speak two household names. He held the line with the physicality of clenched fists and a jaw pressed so hard that the rope imprinted cord lines along the wrist. He breathed through his nose to spare the mouth from foam. You keep silence for whom? The torturer. He moved his tray of iron tools close and tapped an instrument thoughtfully. I keep silence for Saw and Koji, the survivor. They are not part of this. You will cost them more than you will cost yourself. The torturer. He tilted a flat iron so the light hit its edge and made it gleam like a thin promise. A rapid exchange followed as the torturer and the chronicler argued over how to record ambiguous names. Their voices sharpened and fell into quick back and forth lines. "We need a full roster," said the chronicler. "We need numbers for the report," said the torturer. "Without specifics, this is useless," said the chronicler. "Then make him speak or make the damage final," said the torturer. The back and forth lasted only a minute, but it forced the survivor to weigh the cost of a single syllable. The exchange read like a decision tree. Every line pushed him toward a different consequence. The chronicler's hand trembled enough that the torturer noticed and tapped the ledger with a nail, bringing the man back to the task. The mid-chapter cliffhanger arrives when the chronicler lifts the seal and reads a marginal note that ties the procedure to an official investigating magistrate. "It is signed," he said, looking up finally. "It is signed by Inspector Maru." The mention of Inspector Maru rewrote the survivor's understanding. This was not local enforcement. It had oversight from a named authority who could demand permanent removal. The survivor's mouth tightened. He withheld a new name and his chest shook. The torturer looked at the chronicler and then at the chest as if deciding whether to test a new instrument. The torturer introduced a new device beside the chest, a thin iron ring designed to clamp a tendril of skin at the wrist to elicit a different kind of shock. He placed it on the tray and tilted it so the lamplight touched it. The survivor felt the presence of the tool like a promise of escalation. The torturer never raised his voice. His procedure spoke louder than any shout. "We begin prolonged restraint if there is more silence." The torture. The survivor's fear narrowed into a calculation. Some names would likely save him short term but doom others. He weighed the sound of the ledger pages, turning against the small fact of his own life past the next harvest. He tasted metal in his mouth and counted breaths until he could no longer count. He could not see faces beyond the chest lid, but he could hear the chronicler's brush scratch a name into permanence. Then a twist. The chronicler stopped, pushed his glasses up, and read aloud a line on the sealed sheet that no one had expected. The line recorded a prior complaint by a guard who had objected to one of the earlier signatures. The complaint suggested that a mid-ranking officer had forged the signature to escalate procedures for his own political gain. The ledger suddenly suggested that brutality had been weaponized by a man with an agenda. The revelation collapsed a piece of the room's logic. The torturous jaw tightened. "Who is this officer?" he asked. "Senator Atto, the chronicler." It is in his hand once again. The survivor felt a small shift inside him. That knowledge offered leverage, not safety, but the possibility that the ledger contained corrupt records as well as orders. His emotional arc moved from fear to a fragile hope that the ledger might prove culpability for someone above the torturer. He could not say names without risking immediate punishment, but he could choose words to suggest a conduit instead of a direct list. He began to speak differently, offering a route rather than a roster. "They meet by the South Kiln. The survivor, not the mill." "The South Kiln by night, write it." The chronicler. The torturer's hands were steady as he tightened the strap incrementally. "Once we have the place, we can find the others," he said. "Once we have the others, we have the network." The survivor felt the straps ease by the breadth of a thumb. The torturer relaxed enough to remove a loop and let a cord fold. The chest remained closed, but the survivor could draw a deeper breath. He did not trust the relief. Instead, he used it to count his next words. Hours passed as a sequence of adjustments, paper turns, and ink strokes. The chronicler's ledger accumulated more names and more marginalia. The torturer measured water by eye and then by notch on a wooden gauge. The survivor learned the cadence. Each new name brought a small slack. Each hesitation tightened a strap. A sudden arrival in the corridor interrupted the pattern. A woman in a dark scholar's robe entered and carried a small iron bell. Her hands trembled only a little. The chronicler recognized her and whispered the name. "Saku, Inspector's daughter." The chronicler. "She comes with orders." Saku's presence changed the room's direction more than any tool. She unrolled a fresh sheet and placed it on the ledger table. She read a single line, then spoke without raising her voice. Inspection will proceed at first light. Remove the chest. Her eyes met the torturer's, and the torturer's hand rested on the tray of tools as if deciding whether to obey. The torturer obeyed. He unclasped the chest and eased the survivor out. The survivor coughed and hived and sat with his hands on his knees to stop them from trembling. He looked at Saku and saw only a plain face. He could not tell whether she had sympathy, but he could see the ledger open beneath her palm. Saku ran her fingers along the newly written names and then tapped a marginal note. "These signatures are mixed," she said. "Some orders are outside our remit." "Who signed them?" The chronicler Ito's hand appears where there is no authority. Saku. That fact produced an immediate chain reaction. The torturer stepped back as if hit. The survivor felt his emotions shift again. Fear returned, but now threaded with a cautious sense of calculation. If Senator Ito had manipulated orders, then exposing that corruption could reframe his own testimony. He thought of the mill worker Kaito and Sowa. He thought of names he had not spoken. Saku pressed a bell so softly the sound was a small pause, and guards at the outer door acknowledged her. She turned to the chronicler. "Seal the parts that are official. Highlight the forged lines. We will trace them." The chronicler nodded and pressed his brush harder than before. He underlined the forged strokes, and then added a tiny notation that would mark the entries for later scrutiny. The ledger took on the double function of indictment and survival tool. The torturous expression showed the first split between duty and self-preservation. He had followed orders for years. His hands knew the measure of water and the count of straps. Now he watched a document that contained his own compliance in black ink. He placed an instrument back on the tray and studied a notch on the chest's hinge instead of looking at the survivor. The survivor felt the shift. He no longer simply reacted to pain. He began to choose what to reveal and what to protect. He used physical cues to communicate, steadying his breathing, forcing his hands to unclench slightly, so the chronicler could read his willingness to cooperate, without handing over the names he had promised to protect. He took advantage of the ledger's new marginal annotations. The climax arrives when the torturer brings forward a final ultimatum. Permanent mutilation or a list of full names. The room tightened. The chronicler dipped his brush and hesitated, named them all, the torturer, and moved an iron clamp across the table as demonstration. The survivor stayed silent, and his silence became a deliberate act. The torturer reached for a tool, and the chronicler lifted his lamp to watch the response. Saku stepped forward and said, "Stop. The inspector must read the ledger before any permanent harm." The torturer's jaw worked. He did not like delays. He measured the length of a strap with his thumb, and then put it down. "We proceed if we must," he said. A rapid argument erupted. 3 voices, 3 wills. The torturer insisted on discipline and result. The chronicler argued for record and oversight. Saku demanded inspection. The exchange contained 6 quick lines. "You will not act without proof," said Saku. "Proof comes from confession," said the torturer. "Confessions can be coerced," said the chronicler. "Be cautious," said Saku. "Names or damage," said the torturer. "Then let paper decide," said the chronicler. The conflict broke on the ledger. The chronicler closed it and tied a thin thread across the binding to mark the contested entries. The threads not read like a temporary authority. The torturer stepped back and for the moment left his tools in the tray. Dawn edged the cell as Saku led the survivor from the chest to a bench. Guards shifted papers and the chronicler sealed the ledger with wax where he must. The survivor remained hollow-eyed and quiet, but he had made choices. He had named enough to ease the straps and withheld enough to protect specific people. Those choices would carry consequences in other cells and future pages. The final paragraph ties to a concrete beat. The chronicler closed the ledger with a deliberate press of the palm. the wax bloom cooling beneath his fingers. The torturer slid the iron tray back and locked the chest hinge for storage. Saku stepped into the corridor with the bell at her hip, and the survivor held his hands in plain view while a guard passed him a bowl of water and a rough cloth to dab his face. The ledger's thread sat on the table like a recorded decision. That sealed action ends this chapter's accounting and leaves the catalogue complete for now. Cramped confessions. The wooden immobilization chest slammed shut and wood bit into muscle as the hatch was dragged across cold stone. Fear sat raw under the survivor's ribs. He sucked air in short, wet pulls. The torturer locked the hatch with a practiced twist and then set the chest down on the damp floor. That is the immediate problem. The law demanded names, and the chest was the device chosen to extract them. The narrator noted the action without flourish. He catalogued the procedure: restraint, compression, and the introduction of water when words failed. The survivor's name did not appear in ledger entries yet. He had been brought from the trough, still tasting the last pour from the previous chamber where water had spilled over his lips and wooden straps had already marked his wrists. The prior event, the wet trough, left bruises the chronicler later recorded. The narrator's voice reported those marks like evidence, not pity. Inside the chest, the survivor rubbed his jaw against the timber and tested the straps. He kept his mouth closed. He moved a knee and the strap cut flesh. He thought of breath as a resource and counted tiny increases in pain to measure time. The torturer crouched, breathing even. He wore a dark hakama and a leather apron flecked with old water stains. He let the survivor listen to the minor sounds. The rasp of rope, the click of iron, the scrape of a wooden peg sliding into place. The torturer nothing at first. His hands were steady. The names, the torturer finally, low and flat. Not now, the survivor rasped. The chronicler will want them, the torturer replied. The chest shuddered as it was dragged. Each movement turned restrained limbs into new points of friction. The survivor tried to shift weight, then stopped when the wood shaved a new strip of skin. He breathed shallow, counting breaths so he would not lose the sequence of pourings. Fear tightened his throat and made his tongue bulky. He tasted metal. A lamp swung at the cell entrance. The chronicler arrived with a folded mandate tucked into his sleeve and a small oil lamp in his hand. He unrolled the paper on a table outside the cell and read names aloud while the torturer arranged instruments. The chronicler's voice was precise and thin. He pronounced ranks and seal lines with clerical care. He read an official endorsement that ordered results and recorded method. The presence of the mandate turned the chest from private cruelty into sanctioned interrogation. The magistrate demands a list, the chronicler, and the letters on the paper rustled as he shifted it. Then give me their names, the torturer replied, running a leather wrist across a tray of iron tools. You will record every reaction, the chronicler. The ledger will be the proof of method and conformity. The survivor pressed his forehead to the wood and cuffed. He had been below the trough earlier that night, water sloshing over his lips until the world tilted with salt and cold. He heard the memory of that pouring like a bell, precise and timed. He thought of the last time he had been forced to speak. He had named a low retainer and watched that man hang 2 days later. Now the names asked for were different. They pointed higher. The torturer tightened the chest braces. He drove wooden wedges into grooves and tested their purchase with measured strikes. Each wedge reduced space and turned motion into crushing pressure. When he worked, his movements were almost ceremonial. He tilted each instrument to the lamplight, inspected for fault, and set it back beside the tray. He spoke only to the chest and the ledger. Breathe slow, he told the survivor as he adjusted a strap. The survivor drew air and tried to obey. His voice came small. I have nothing else to give. You will make another choice, the torturer. Either names or continued compression. The survivor swallowed hard and tried to bargain. Fear shifted into calculation. He offered a name of a minor assistant to spare himself. The torturer did not respond immediately. He moved to the trough and fetched a jug. The chronicler stepped closer and peered into the slight opening at the hatch edge. He identified a talisman wrapped at the survivor's forearm. The talisman was carved wood, old and worn. This, the chronicler and his fingers hovered above the survivor's hand. This marks a retainer of House Iwasato. The words altered the room like a struck bell. The torturer's hands paused over the jug. The survivor's eyes widened. Where fear had been calculation, it bent into dread. The presence of that talisman reframed everything. The interrogation was no longer a routine sweep. It had suddenly become a political probe. You hide him, the chronicler. Not hide the survivor. The words were thin. I knew him. I carried messages. The chronicler pulled the lamp closer and scanned the small carved image. He put the talisman on the table and compared it with entries in a leather-bound codex. A single line linked the talisman to a high retainer who answered to the magistrate's counsel. The chronicler's breath was visible in the lamp glow. He looked at the torturer and read the endorsement again. Higher than we expected, the chronicler. They want that ring closed. You mean they want names? The torturer answered. A new emotion flowed through the survivor. Panic, then a brittle resolve. He suddenly understood why the straps had been sharpened. He tried to bargain again, but this time the bargain would have political weight. Naming a high retainer would condemn more than a single life. He clenched his jaw and considered silence. The torturer introduced a tightening mechanism. He set a screw-driven cam against the chest's side and began to turn. Each quarter turn lowered the lid toward the survivor's face by millimeters. The wood moved, and the survivor's throat compressed with it. He coughed and gagged. Now the torturer, the survivor, gasped. He coughed a name that would spare the retainer, but implicate a different retainer in a minor theft. The chronicler wrote it down. His strokes were quick, mechanical. The torturer eased the mechanism, testing whether the survivor had lied. The survivor had not told the whole truth. That became clear when the chronicler produced a sealed endorsement naming a specific high retainer by office and a neighborhood near the West Gate. The narrator recorded the endorsement with the same detached tone used for tools and seal wax. The endorsement raised stakes because it indicated orders from above. The torturer looked at the chronicler and then at the survivor. You lied, the torturer. I gave you away, the survivor through gritted teeth. That way leads to other bodies, the chronicler. The torturer tightened another wedge. The survivor's breath became a thin wire. He tried to speak and found words like pebbles in his mouth. The chronicler leaned in and wrote the time of a cough. He recorded the survivor's skin losing color. He noted how the hands trembled even against the wood. The ledger's ink marked the facts and erased mercy. The survivor shifted again, small motions that scraped fresh blisters. He tried to offer more. A name of a messenger who had carried coins. He paused. The torturer tilted his head. The torturous expression did not change. He only tilted a small iron key ring in the lamp glow and set the jug down. You will not trade truth for comfort, the torturer. The survivor's fear yielded to a different motion. Bargaining turned to bargaining with the self. He considered which names would protect which people. He thought of the man hanged 2 nights prior. He thought of his own family. The chronicler's eyes flicked up when he heard the survivor mention the retainer's quarter. The chronicler closed the ledger for a moment and then reopened it to find a margin note he had made earlier that connected the retainer to another record. An outside knock sounded at the corridor gate. The knock was soft but precise. Everyone's heads turned. The torturer's hand paused over the cam. The chronicler folded the mandate and tucked it beneath the lamp. The survivor listened to the knock and felt the chest swood against his cheek like a slow metronome. Who is there? The torturer called. A voice from the corridor answered. A messenger from the magistrate. The council awaits a progress report. The torturer and the chronicler exchanged a quick look. The addition of a messenger elevated urgency. The torturer tightened the cam another half-turn to remind the survivor of consequence. An external event intervened, the messenger's arrival, but it only raised the pressure. The torturer fetched water. He poured cold water into a small basin, lifted a ladle, and let a slow stream drip into the chest through a narrow vent. The water curled along the inside planks and pooled near the survivor's hips. He thrashed and sucked air as wood and water fought for space in his lungs. The torturer measured reactions with the ledger at hand. The chronicler noted the survivor's gasps, the angle of his head, the scrape of his nails. The narrator maintained a surgical cadence. He described each motion, the ladder of breaths, the tilt of the lamp, the chronicler as ink, stained fingers. He never called the surgeon cruel. He listed acts and timestamps. But the survivor's trimmer and the torturer's mechanical patience delivered all needed emotion. Names the chronicler, and his pen scratched swiftly. The survivor coughed and spat a partial sequence. His cadence broke. He one high name and two lower ones. The chronicler repeated each aloud clearly, so there could be no mistake. House Iwasato, the survivor. Matsu of the West Gate. Sato's boy, Kenji. Kenji, the chronicler repeated and wrote. The torturer stopped the pour and listened. He waited for signs of fabrication. A stutter, a hesitation, a name that did not fit. The survivor's voice quivered but did not break. He had learned to keep syllables even. The torturer set the ladle aside and tested the wedge again. He turned the cam, the wood bit deeper. A new reveal followed. The chronicler, his lamp tilted, found a smear of fresh ink on a margin that matched the survivor's description of a messenger. The ink indicated receipt of a bribe. The chronicler's mouth tightened. He looked up and announced that the ledger already contained a reference to an exchange connected to the retainer's house. The narrative changed. The survivors' names were not merely suspects. They linked to recorded corrupt payments. That changes orders, the chronicler. How? The torturer. It means this is larger than theft, the chronicler. It implies collusion with a magistrate official. The torturer's fingers tightened on the cam. The survivor's skin pearled with cold sweat. The fear that had first driven him to bargaining now spliced with shame. He felt the weight of his choices press like the wedges. You gave names, the torturer. They were recorded. The magistrate will act. The survivor tried to explain. I carried letters. I never saw the magistrate's hand. You did enough, the chronicler. The torturer took the jug and filled the ladle again. He poured a measured stream, slower now, and the water rose to the survivor's chest. The survivor's breath tightened to a leaden effort. His eyelids fluttered. The chronicler bent his head, whispering name pronunciations into the ledger to ensure clarity. He wrote each cough and each pleading phrase. In the middle of that pressure, the survivor tried a different tactic. He coughed and forced a laugh that came out as a rasp. I will tell you where they meet, he offered. There is a house by the river with the painted gate. Which house? The torturer. The second painted gate. At dawn. The one with the blue lintel. The chronicler paused, then scrawled the detail. The torturer halted the pour and looked to the chronicler. This could be verified, the chronicler. A new shift hit the survivor. From pleading to hope, small and naive, he imagined that the verification might spare him. The torturer's face did not change, but he unlocked the cam and opened a narrow air gap, just enough to let the survivor gasp without drowning. The water sloshed around his waist. Outside the cell, footsteps approached and then stopped. A voice that none of them recognized called through the bars. Report, it said. The chronicler stood and answered with the recorded names and the detail of the painted gate. The unnamed voice responded with a curt demand for confirmation and said a retainer would be sent to verify. The sound of distant boots faded. The survivor closed his eyes and tried to hold the breath the torturer allowed. He started to shiver. He had given names. He had given a location. He had given enough for a retainer to be traced. The torturer eased the water back into the jug and set it on the tray. He removed a small iron instrument, wiped it with a rag, and placed it beside the ledger as if it were a pen. The chronicler sealed the page with a dot of hot wax and then blew on it to cool. The wax hardened quickly and the seal left a ridged ring. He then wrote a short notation, time, names, method. The narrator recorded each of these steps. He noted that the ledger served to make confessions permanent and that the system converted whispered names into official papers. The survivor's breathing steadied in the gap the torturer had left. He kept his face turned to the tiny opening where the lamp's circle lit the chest interior. He listened to the chronicler's pen and to the torturer's slow cleaning. The room had the smell of oil lamp smoke, cold stone, and wet wood. The narrative voice placed those details as factual anchors, not images. The torturer closed the clamp and pulled free the straps. He eased the hatch and lifted it slowly. The survivor staggered out when the hatch was clear. His shoulders slumped. The torturer held his wrist and checked the rope marks. The chronicler took the survivor's talisman and examined it one last time. He then put it in his pocket. You will go with the retainer, the chronicler. Who will go? The survivor. A retainer will verify the location, the chronicler. You will be watched. The torturer guided the survivor to a bench. He removed tangles of hair that had stuck to the straps. The survivor's hands trembled, and he kept rubbing his forearm where the talisman had been. The torturer did not soften. He only handed the survivor a wrapped strip of cloth to bind his wrist. Remember the men you named, the torturer? The survivor nodded. He felt a hollow where certainty had been. He left a wet print on the bench when he stood. The chronicler returned to the ledger, bound the new entries, and stamped the seal into the cover. The stamp knocked with a hollow click. The torturer cleaned his instruments and arranged them back into the tray. The narrator recorded the closure. Names written, seals affixed, method archived. The chest, the cam, the ladle, the ledger, all became proof. As they prepared to leave, the survivor looked up once. He caught the chronicler's steady ink-stained gaze. Will they spare anyone? He asked. The chronicler put the talisman into the ledger's pocket and did not answer directly. The narrator closed the chapter with a concrete note. The ledger went to the Ark of Records. The retainer would be dispatched at dawn. House Iwaseto would be watched. The chronicler closed the ledger, pressed the seal, and the echo of the stamp rolled down the corridor as the torturer set the tray of tools aside. Outside, a door opened somewhere along the magistrate's wing. The sound carried and then was gone. The survivor wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, folded the cloth around his wrist, and stood to follow the chronicler into the corridor. The chapter ended with the ledger sealed and a gate about to open. Emotion root. Fear. The survivor's choices through fear forced bargains, then dread and shame, and finally a brittle hope that verification might alter the outcome. Emotion shifts occurred. Fear to calculation, to panic, to bargaining, and then to resignation. The stage was set for a verification that would either vindicate the survivor's choices or escalate reprisals further. System of confessions. Water hit his lips again. The cup trembled in the torturer's hand and a clean, cold trickle filled the survivor's mouth while a leather strap cut under his shoulder. Fear knotted the survivor's belly and pushed his hands toward the wood. He could not reach the bindings. The torturer, names, and the word landed like a command that bent the room toward one outcome. The first 5 sentences contain fear. That fear drove the survivor's first attempts to bargain, to stall, to breathe on the rhythm of the pause. The chamber was a cistern built under the eastern wing of a manor that had once kept grain, not men. The narrator's ledger would later list dates and officials, but in the immediate minutes the room smelled of cold stone, old algae, and the faint iron of blood from earlier wounds. The survivor had come from a rank of minor attendants who had argued in the courtyard 2 weeks prior. He had been taken after a blunt accusation at dawn. The problem was simple and deadly. Extract names to fill a sealed directive that would justify executions higher than any one torturer's authority. The torturer stood with a tray of implements and a thin patience. He moved like a man who timed rituals by the tilt of a hand, not by impulse. The survivor's chest rose in short pulls. He tried to speak, to throw a single syllable into the water and hope a word would count. But the cup blocked his tongue, and his breath broke into the drip speak clearly, the torturer, or drown on a single name. The torturer's voice was flat. The words left no room for pleading. The chronicler arrived carrying a lamp and a sealed codex. He set the lamp on a low crate, unrolled a fresh sheet of bark paper, and placed the codex beside the ledger. The torturer gestured for him to sit. "Write what he says," the torturer ordered. "Every syllable will become law." The chronicler, who had recorded beatings and council orders for 30 years, slid the ink brush into his palm and bowed his head. He smelled of oil lamp smoke and ink. "Chronicler." The torturer, "Not a question. You will notarize this." The chronicler's hand hesitated over the paper. A thin tremor ran through his fingers. He did not look at the survivor. He opened the codex long enough to feel the weight of the seal, and then shut it again. The room leaned on that seal the way a bell leans on a clapper. The recorded names would make the murders official. The torturer produced the cradle. It was a narrow, nailed frame with clamps for the shoulders and a false floor that allowed the water line to reach the torso, while keeping the head bound to the beam. He ran a palm along the wood and named the ritual steps aloud as if teaching a student. "Clamp here. Tie there. Fill slowly. Mark each pause. Record the first name, then the second. No more than 3 words per breath." The survivor watched the movement of that palm. His fear evolved into a different motion. Calculation. He counted the teeth on the clamps and traced with his mind how many loosening attempts might succeed. The first emotion shift arrived in a small act. The survivor tried to shift a knee under the straps. His ankle scraped the wet stone. The torturer tightened a cleat with the same calm and clicked a key ring to a hook. "Easy," the torturer. "You breathe when I permit it." The survivor's body answered with a flare of resistance. He jerked, then settled, drawing breath through clenched teeth. That jerk turned fear into stubbornness. He would not make the simple concession the torturer demanded. The chronicler's brush scratched in the margin as the ritual began. He recorded the torturer's commands with exact strokes while the survivor swallowed water and spat silence. Outside the lamplight, the chronicler's eyes flicked toward a folded directive he had been handed that afternoon. The one sealed by a commander whose signature had been stamped with a red cord. He recognized a line in the directive that differed from what the torturer recited now. The second emotion shift took root in that small discovery. Doubt crept into the chronicler's hands. "Speak." The torturer snapped names. The survivor breathed around the cup and said, "I have nothing to give." "Then this will teach you." The torturer answered, and he opened the sluice longer so water spilled faster against the survivor's lips. The survivor's breath forced into trapped gulps. "Tell me where they meet." The torturer demanded. "Tell me who brings the papers. Tell me who signed the petition." Each demand sat like a stone on the chest. Dialogue became the engine of the room. The survivor coughed and then managed a line, short and deliberate. "I saw Kaito at the granary," he said. "Kaito signed nothing." "Kaito," the chronicler wrote. And his brush left a black stroke on the bark. "What else?" The torturer, "Name another." The survivor's lips closed. He drew a breath and then, in a whisper that the lamp carried, said, "Not odor." "Not odor," his voice broke. The torturer's fingers closed on a clamp with a ticked impatience. The torturer tilted the cradle into a higher fill and spoke the ritual instructions aloud again, faster. He enumerated the steps. Hold the head level, tighten the straps at the 3rd beat. Pause for the ledger. The chronicler's pen hesitated. He glanced at the sealed directive again and mouthed the first syllable of a name that did not match the survivor's words. The room filled with the sound of the water and the steady scratch of ink. At the stone workbench, the torturer showed the chronicler a tightening tool and demonstrated the exact cadence of the straps, saying, "Once the ledger takes the name." They go without trial, the chronicler's lips pressed thin. He wrote, slowly, as if testing the ink's adherence to truth. Chronicler, the torturer softly, record only my words and the man's. Seal it. The rest will follow. This exchange formed a hesitation in the ledger's life. The chronicler held the authority to choose whether written law would match oral command. A sudden outside knock rattled the stairwell and sent a small tremor through the cistern's stone. Footsteps hurried overhead. The torturer frowned and lifted his head, but then he returned to the cradle methodically. An external event broke the room's rhythm and raised the stakes. If a messenger had come, the names on the ledger could move faster than a man's breath. The survivor used that pause to breathe deliberately and to scan the chronicler's face for weakness. Stop. The chronicler allowed. The single word cut the water's hiss. He set the brush down, stood, and turned the codex so that the seal faced the lamplight. There is a directive here that states 2 names must be verified by counsel, not by confession alone, he said. His voice had the dry, whispery certainty of someone who had read rules for decades. The torturer's shoulders tightened. He moved toward the ledger and peered at the sealed cord. The torturer's jaw worked. You question orders? He asked. His voice remained neutral, but the threat carried weight. The survivor watched 2 men measure authority. One with metal and ritual, the other with rules inked in bureaucratic lines. The codex is mine to record. The chronicler replied, I will not falsify what I write. The torturer's hand flicked toward the key ring at his belt. The room felt as if it might split along a seam of paper and wood. Rapid back and forth followed. The council will not wait for your niceties. The torturer, the council will be convinced by names on paper. Names must be the man's words. The chronicler snapped, if you force them, they are invalid. Then you make them invalid and the men are spared. The torturer challenged, chronicler, write or sit mute while I proceed. The exchange ran 3 to 6 quick lines, each short and clipped. Outside, the footsteps had not returned. The survivor seized that argument as a tool. He spoke in fragments that could be true and would fit the directive's scope. Kaito, he said. Kaito and Taro. The torturous hands moved to the ledger. The chronicler hesitated and then wrote. He did not yet add the name the sealed directive expected. The room tilted. The ledger would carry what his brush allowed. The torturer began the controlled tide. Water slithered into the cradle and lapped around the survivor's ribs. The straps bit deeper under each tightening. The survivor's throat filled with cold. His throat worked and produced one clear line. Kaito and Taro and Matsu. The chronicler wrote each name with measured strokes. The water rose to the survivor's chin and held. He tasted salt on his tongue and the metallic tang of rust from the cradle's nails. The torturer watched the ledger as if the black strokes were already a verdict. The climax arrived as the water reached the survivor's nose and the torturer pressed the final clamp. He named the signatory, named the commander who sent the seal. The survivor's eyes rolled. He could not breathe without the cup's mercy. He forced a name out on a ragged breath. Commander Ito. The chronicler's hand froze over the paper. The sealed directive had borne a stamp that matched the commander's mark, but the chronicler's memory told him the seal's attached instruction had been to verify names at council, an instruction the torturer was now bypassing. The room held a single, cruel count. The torturer's fingers rested on the lever that would flood the cradle further and push the survivor under. The survivor's throat closed around his own name like a fist. He spat. It was Ito, then coughed air and added, Ito and Oda. The torturer's face did not change. He simply moved his hand and began the second phase of the ritual that would make the confession irreversible on paper. During the forced confession, the chronicler made a different choice. He lifted his brush and, instead of writing the names precisely as pronounced, he added a marginal note. The directive's citation number and a single word that would force review if read by the proper clerk. He wrote it in a manner that only another scribe would notice. An administrative cross, reference that implied a contradiction. This was the twist. The chronicler did not merely record. He inserted a trace that could undo the torturer's unilateral execution if an official checked the ledger. His hand shook when he closed the bracket, but he did not stop. The torturer noticed only at the final line. He leaned over the paper and read the cross reference. His lip curled. "You put that there on purpose," he said. "You risk the whole operation." The chronicler answered, "I risk my station for what I record." The torturer's next movement was not immediate violence. He moved with method. He reached for the survivor and eased the water down so the man coughed and breathed again. The choice he made in that moment was clinical. Remove the immediate danger to preserve the ritual record. Outside the chamber, a lantern bearing guard climbed the stair and halted when he saw the sealed codex closed on the bench. He did not yet enter. His hesitance created a narrow window. The ledger might be altered before anyone knew. The torturer removed wet tools from the floor and rinsed them in the cistern. He stacked them in the tray as if preparing for a later use. The survivor lay slack, lungs shuddering. The chronicler rose and pressed the seal over the ledger with a pressure that left a wet smear where his thumb had brushed the written margin. The aftershock of the night's work was a series of small, practical acts. The torturer dragged the cradle aside and closed the hatch that concealed the sluice. He wiped the straps on a stone slab. The chronicler hesitated with the brush, then wrapped it in cloth. He did not yet commit the ledger to the sealed codex. Instead, he slid the ledger under the codex as if hiding a footnote in a book. The survivor was dragged a short distance and propped against a damp wall, where he breathed in ragged, wet pulls. The narrator recorded the final line in the official voice. The ledger reflected names now inked, the seal now bound. But the narrative also recorded the chronicler's marginal cross reference, a note that might travel upward and alter the fate of those named. The room's decision would ripple. The torturer had acted with the authority of cold procedure, and the chronicler had responded with the quiet rebellion of a scribe who still obeyed a different law. The chapter closed with something precise and physical. The chronicler stood at the lamp, slid the sealed codex into its carrying case, and locked it with the simple iron clasp he always used. He turned the clasp and set the codex under his arm. "I will carry this to the registry," he said, addressing no one and everyone. The torturer glanced at him once and then began to climb the narrow stairs alone. The survivor's fingers twitched once around a talisman he had kept wrapped on his forearm. A final external event arrived. A footman at the top of the stair called down a single name, "Chronicler, San," and the voice sounded urgent. The chronicler lifted a lamp and paused. He had made one concrete decision in ink. Whether that mark would save lives or be edited out depended on the next clerk who read the cross reference. He cupped the lamp, stepped toward the stair, and the chapter ended on that step. The chronicler ascending into the corridor with the sealed codex weighing against his chest and a single damp thumbprint on its edge. The emotional aftertaste was not a moral sermon. It was a ledger left ajar and a footstep on cold stone. The survivor would be moved. The torturer would tidy his tools. The chronicler would walk into a corridor where the codex might be checked or crushed. The ledger's marginal note would travel, and with it a chance that the night's brutality would be reviewed by eyes that had the power to change names from execution to inquiry. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict. The forced confession occurred and the ledger was closed, while leaving a concrete chain of events that set the next chapter's danger. A review that could punish the torturer or validate the killings, depending on the clerk who read a tiny cross reference. Ledger of names. The chronicler slammed the ledger open on the table and the lamp's flame jumped. Names lay in tight columns, each written in different hands. Fear tightened the survivor's throat and made him chew the inside of his cheek. Fear moved his hands before thought could. The lamplight cut the room into a small country of glare and shadow, and the ledger sat at its center like an accusation. The immediate problem was physical. The ledger asked for names, and the ledger could order pain or death. The chronicler pushed the leather back and tapped a row with a calloused finger. "Read them," he said. "Point." His voice was dry and methodical. The torturer did not speak. He folded his arms and let the silence press. The survivor's breath came in short pulls that matched the rhythm of earlier nights, short pulls learned under a wooden trough and a rough hand. That memory, water spilling across lips while wooden straps bit wet skin, sat beneath the new question and pushed him toward a choice. The narrator recorded the placement of the ledger with a flat note, each sentence even and precise. The narrator did not plead. He stated, he wrote. The ledger was found in a hidden folio behind a loose stone in the alcove. The ledger contained more than names. Margins held dates, a column of marks, and faint droplets that had bled into the ink. "You know these names." The chronicler to the survivor. "You know one of them." The survivor's fingers tightened on the talisman at his wrist. He looked at the ink, then away. The first shift in emotion came in hesitation. Doubt arrived before fear. The survivor stared at the names and tried to fit faces to letters. He traced the strokes with a trembling index. Doubt pulled at him. Some names were common, others scarce. The survivor's memory held mere glimpses, an embroidered sash here, a low laugh there, a retainer's emblem hanging near a corridor. I don't know, not all of them." His voice thinned. The chronicler bent his head and compared a line to an earlier note. "You know this one." The chronicler. He tapped a name with the tip of his brush. The torturer's jaw tightened. An external event. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. A guard's shadow passed beyond the lamp. The torturer moved the ledger and carried it like an instrument. He opened to a different page and began to check against a smudged list he kept in his apron. The chronicler tilted his lamp. He set his oil lamp closer so the survivor could not avoid the letters. "Point to the one who traded the crate of rice." The torturer. "Point to the one who carried the mark on the wrist." He was precise. His questions were measured like the motions he used when tilting tools to the light. The survivor's mind snapped between images. He had seen a retainer, broad shoulders beneath a washed indigo cloak, pass near the cistern the morning the prisoner had been brought in. He saw a hand with a thin scar on the brow. He saw, in another flash, the wooden chest hitting the floor and the hatch slamming shut, as in the earlier night when the chest bit into muscle. The memory was not a blur. It was the sound of the hatch, the smell of wet wood, the taste of metal on his tongue. Those details forced his memory into a shape. He mouthed a syllable. "That one," he said at last, and pointed. The second emotion shift arrived with naming. His hesitation hardened into acute guilt, and then into a fierce need to survive. Guilt came as a physical thing, his hands dampened, his mouth filled with a metallic taste. Survival imposed itself like a mathematical problem. Name one and the immediate pain ends. Name none and pain continues or becomes worse. The torturer's eyes narrowed. The chronicler's brush paused above the page. The narrator wrote the time in a small, detached hand. "You are sure?" The chronicler. His question was an anchor. It demanded clarity. The survivor swallowed. "Yes," he said. "Yes, it was him." The man with the emblem. The torturer took the ledger, turned it so his face would not show his surprise, then blinked once and swallowed a breath he did not sound. For a heartbeat, the ledger was not paper, it was a lever, a new event. The lamp's flame guttered as a draft moved along the corridor. The torturer snapped the ledger shut and reached for a key on his iron ring. He stepped toward the corridor where emblems hung. "Bring the emblem here." He ordered the nearest guard. "Bring the retainer as token." The guard ran. The chronicler watched him go and drew a line through the name with a fine, clinical stroke. They moved from the archival alcove to the corridor. The chronicler carried the lamp on its cradle, the light sweeping over hung banners, and the emblem the survivor had named. The torturer cut his hands quick and clean when he banded a strap. He wrapped the survivor's wrists with fresh cord and pressed the leather until the survivor made a small, involuntary sound. The narrator's notes were steady. Date, hour, witnesses. The exact phrasing the survivor used. He says the retainer with the emblem. The chronicler read aloud, and the words settled in the corridor like an order. The third external event. The retainer's emblem was produced, an embroidered badge with faded gold thread. The torturer paused and ran a thumb along the thread. He frowned. The chronicler leaned forward and compared the badge to a sketched mark in his codex. This emblem belongs to Hattori Shijin, the chronicler. The name landed in the corridor like a struck bell. The torturer's fingers flexed around the ledger. The survivor's chest heaved, each breath shallow and fast. Dialogue quickened. Hattori Shijin. The torturer, Hattori Shijin, is a retainer to Lord Matsuda. Hattori Shijin. The survivor said again, quieter, yes. Hattori Shijin. The torturer spoke 3 rapid lines. Hattori Shijin stands accused by this ledger. The chronicler. Hattori Shijin's emblem matches. Hattori Shijin will answer. The torturer replied, Hattori Shijin knows of the system. The words repeated the name and fixed it where listeners could not miss it. The narrator wrote the exchange with neutral clarity. The emotional scale shifted again. The room moved from fear to alarm in the torturer, and from relief to crushing regret in the survivor. The survivor's relief at naming someone who could be punished was immediate. It stilled the next pour of cold water. Then regret arrived as a lead weight. He saw for a moment the retainer's face, kind eyes beneath the top knot. He felt the talisman in his hand as if it were a stone, a decisive event. The torturer ordered immediate immobilization and a harsher procedure to follow. He directed 2 guards to set up a fresh wooden chest. Now, he said, we bind him until the retainer is found and until the ledger confirms his guilt. The chronicler tilted his lamp and wrote each word. The immobilization stall smelled of damp timber. The torturer tightened the hatch as he had done before, with the practiced twist that left the survivor gasping. The survivor's rib muscles burned from the straps. You will speak again, the torturer. You will show where else the ledger hides names. The survivor, us breathing clipped. The lamp's halo cut the wood into bars on his skin. Hattori Shijin. He whispered into the dark, and his voice broke. In the stall, the survivor tried to reconcile what he had seen with what he had not seen. He remembered a knocked pot of rice, a retainer's boot slipping on stone, a hand with a thin scar. Those were concrete images. He pressed them against the letters on the page in his mind until they fit. He tried to recall where Hattori Shijin had stood during the transports. His mouth filled with the memory of water on his lips and the sound of the hatch slamming. He could still feel the H, where wood had cut into muscle. That sensory recall pushed him to add names of sites. The cistern, the trapdoor by the pantry, the chest in the east cell. He offered these to the chronicler in labored breath. The chronicler wrote them down without pause. Cistern entrance, he said. East cell hatch. Pantry trapdoor, he read back each location, and the torturer's hands moved with those names. They were not idle phrases. Each location changed where the torturer would search next. The ledger, now annotated with fresh entries, shifted power toward action. The torturer stood and packed his tray of iron tools. He tilted each instrument to the light and checked every surface, metallic scraping like a ritual. An unexpected twist occurred when the chronicler's sink smudged. Water from the survivor's collapsing body had leaked onto the ledger and stained the margins. The letters blurred at one column, and an auxiliary name under Hattori Shijin's was only half legible. The chronicler cursed softly, wiped the page, and then with a steady hand reconstructed the letters from the survivor's halting speech. The half-name resolved into a household steward whose insignia had been absent from records. That widening of the accusation surprised everyone. Rapid dialogue followed, 3 to 5 quick exchanges as the torturer and chronicler argued about immediate procedure. Check the steward. The torturer. Check the steward now. We must record him correctly, the chronicler replied. If I miswrite him, the record will be useless. Record first, then bind him, the torturer insisted. I will not chase ghosts. Bind him while we verify, the chronicler countered. The ledger will remain with me. They traded short lines and shifted positions. The survivor listened, and each clipped sentence tightened the space around his choice. The ledger's presence turned the chronicler into an arbiter. He insisted on formal phrasing, an exact line of testimony. The survivor's voice broke, and the torturer interpreted each break as a new lever. The narrator wrote what the chronicler ordered and what the torturer carried out. The survivor, between breath and confession, offered names of couriers and rotes. He described a retainer with a scar who walked with a limp after a fight near the river crossing. Those details were concrete. They could be checked. At one point, a sudden external event moved the plot. Distant banging from the guardroom, followed by a shouted name, Lord Matsuda-sen's men, a guard shouted. The corridor filled with restless feet. The torturer closed the ledger and tucked the copy into his apron. He looked at the chronicler and then at the survivor. If Hattori Shijin is brought, we will hear the answer now, he said. The chronicler nodded and sealed the current notes with a small wax token. The survivor slumped after the new immobilization and offered a broken narration that smeared ink and water across the ledger as the chronicler recorded each fractured sentence. He spoke of a night when the water in the trough tasted of iron, of a voice that said, names, and the sound of someone turning a wheel in the cistern. The chronicler wrote, the torturer listened for corroboration. The narrator later transcribed the ledger entry in his detached register. The survivor's words were ragged. He stood by the cistern. Hattori tied the rope. The chronicler wrote that down and then drew a line. A surprise turned the ledger into a weapon. A line in the margin noted that the retainer named Hattori had once been seen arguing with a steward over missing grain. The petty quarrel now looked like motive. The torturous expression shifted from procedural to intent. He ordered the survivor taken again to the immobilization stall while sending a runner to detain the steward. The chapter's climax arrived when the torturer ordered the harsher procedure, and the chronicler set his lamp to record every motion. The survivor was strapped into the chest and the hatch shut with the same grinding, intimate brutality described earlier. The narrator's tone did not change. He stated the actions and listed the witnesses. The survivor screamed once, a wet sound that the room catalogued like data. The torturer then leaned into the ledger's authority and, using its pages, read out an accusation that would be used to justify the escalation. The fibers of paper had become legal argument. When the procedure ended, the survivor collapsed. Ink and water had smeared across the ledger where he had cuffed and touched the page. The chronicler recorded the fragmented confession and signed the entry with precise strokes. The narrator closed his shorthand and declared the record sealed for now. The torturer withdrew into ritual composure and strapped his tools back into the tray. The final sequence resolved the chapter's immediate conflict. The ledger was resealed and returned into its hiding place. The chronicler wrapped the scroll in oiled linen, placed the small wax token across the seam, and set it into the alcove behind the loose stone. The torturer took the survivor to a shallow cot, where he lay with his wrists bruised and his breathing ragged. The narrator recorded the time of sealing and the names entered. The survivor stared at the ceiling and did not speak. He held the talisman and felt its carved edges bite into his palm. A last external noise arrived. A knock at the outer gate, measured and deliberate. The chronicler looked up from the sealed ledger. The torturer straightened. The narrator wrote the knock as an event and set a time. The chapter ended on that knock, concrete, physical, and immediate, so the ledger's seal would not be the last word. The ledger would outlive bodies, and the knock promised action beyond the alcove as men moved to answer accusation with armor and oath. Final entry, the last extraction. Guards shove the gaunt survivor across the flagstones and slam him onto the low stone platform while the torturer stands, waiting with straps and a shallow sunken tub. Fear tightens the survivor's throat. The central problem is clear: he must give names or others will be punished. The chronicler sets the ledger beside the lamp and opens to the last column, the lamp's flame lifting a small, folded scrap from the page. Fear drives the survivor's first words and will push every choice he makes through this night. The narrator records what follows without flourish: a forced procession, a room organized by authority, and a stated purpose: extraction. Guards push back against the survivor's ribs. The survivor spits a little blood. He coughs and tries to swallow words. Names, says the torturer without raising his voice. The torturer repeats the single syllable until the room conforms to it. The chronicler does not look away. He arranges the ledger, the pen hovering above a blank line. The lamplight makes the ink appear wet and waiting. The torturer straps the survivor into a constricting wooden frame. Leather bites under collarbones. The survivor's fingers find the talisman under his shift, and he fingers it like a promise and a weight. He is 30 breaths away from drowning or from naming someone who will be taken at dawn. Start with local names, the chronicler says. We need clear record. His voice is dry, precise. The torturer answers with action. He tightens the straps, checks the wrist bindings, and lays a shallow tub beneath the survivor's chest. He moves with the same ritual cadence as in previous sessions in this keep. The chest, the cup, the ledger, a documented machine of procedure. The survivor's hands jerk against the wood. I told you I don't know their names, he says. The voice is thin, torn. He says I don't know twice, then a third time, as if repetition might force truth into the room. The torturer tilts a cup of cold water. He watches the survivor's chest pin under a strap, and then pours a measured stream into the survivor's mouth. The scene echoes earlier events. The wooden immobilization chest slammed shut in a previous night. Water hit lips, a cup trembled in the torturer's hand, the ledger recorded names. The narrator notes those incidents as facts and connects them as pattern. The survivor remembers the chest and the tub, and the way wood bit into muscle. He remembers the chronicler's lamp and the ledger's tight columns. Those memories steer each refusal and each bargain. The torturer's hands are collused. He places a leather strap across the survivor's sternum and tightens until each inhalation becomes a fight against the straps. The water comes in short, cold increments. The survivor's breaths shorten. He coughs, tastes iron, and when he manages to speak it is to barter. If I give you a name, what will you do for Goro? The survivor says, fingers working the talisman, Goro is my brother. Goro is not involved, he says the names like a plea. The torturer glances at the chronicler. Names or more water, he says. Names and the ledger gets closure. No names and the ledger gets appendices. His voice is low and clinical. The chronicler's pen hovers above the page for a beat too long. The chronicler lifts his lamp closer and reads aloud from the ledger, Entry 9. 3 names supplied this month. Entry 10, 2 names, 1 retracted. Entry 11, he flips the page and a scrap falls. The scrap bears a single name folded and smeared. The chronicler straightens and says, there is a name missing here. His tone is not surprise so much as a verification of an inconsistency. The survivor's eyes widen. He moves his head. Who? He asks. The chronicler lets the folded scrap fall open on the table. Someone found protection, he says. He reads the name aloud in a dry voice, and the sound makes the torturer's hand tighten on the leather strap. This name belongs to a household close to the torturer's quarters, the chronicler adds, and the air between them sharpens. For the first time in the night, the torturer's stance cracks. He steps away from ritual and towards something personal. The torturer does not speak much, but his mouth sets into an angle of decision. His hand moves to the small iron key ring at his belt, then stops. The survivor sees this and bargains again, each bargain a small shift in the room's power. If you spare Goro, the survivor says, I will say another name. I will say the name that will make you close the ledger and go home. He says it quickly, like a trade offered on a corner. The torturous reply is emotion. He reaches for the cup, tilts it, and pours another short stream of water into the survivor's mouth. The water traces cold down the survivor's throat and pushes at the lungs. The survivor chokes. He coughs up a small foam of blood. The chronicler writes down the survivor's gasps as they fall between the straps. He notes the time in a column, eyes moving back and forth between the ledger and the body. The ritual becomes a documented contradiction. The ledger demands names, yet the ledger also holds names that do not match the pattern. Emotion shifts occur in small movements. Doubt turns to bargaining in the survivor. The torturous clinical detachment shifts toward a tightness that looks like embarrassment or fear for his household. The chronicler's reverence for record keeping shifts to a hesitation that hints at conscience. Those shifts appear in the way hands tremble, how the pen pauses, how the straps are tightened a notch. The survivor's lips form partial syllables. He remembers the immobilization chest and the wood biting into his back from Chapter 2. He tastes the same cold water from Chapter 3. Those concrete memories force the survivor's speech to a narrower path. Tell me the name you want, the torturer says, voice low. The survivor reaches toward his talisman and unwraps the cloth with a trembling hand. He pulls out a small carved token, a wooden bead with a jagged edge and a streak of paint. He places it on the ledger beside the lamp. The chronicler leans in and touches the bead with a stained finger. Where did you get this? The torturer asks from the shrine near the river. The survivor says, it belonged to someone who swore protection. It belonged to... He stops because the straps tighten. His voice becomes a thin rasp, to Riku of the torturous house. I kept it hidden because I had to keep it. I kept it because... The chronicler's eyes narrow. He flips through the ledger to earlier entries and finds, in a margin note, a small caret pointing to a name. Riku. The pen sink has a different hand. The chronicler reads that marginal line aloud. Riku paid for transport. Riku sheltered one named Kenta last winter. He looks up. This links the name to your household, he says to the torturer. A new event occurs. A concrete piece of evidence, the talisman and the marginal note, changes how everyone in the room understands the night. The torturer stiffens, then drops his gaze to the table. He runs a thumb over a scar on his brow and says, Riku is my younger. He is not named in my household record, chronicler. Where did you find this? The chronicler replies, it fell from the last ledger when I opened the page. It was folded between names. He pushes the scrap and the bead toward the torturer. Records do not lie, though they can be shaped. This is now part of the record. The chronicler's voice is precise and carries the weight of authority. The survivor exhales and finds a name, but he is no longer bargaining for Goro alone. He has forced a connection that implicates the torturer's own household. This revelation is the twist required by the outline. The token links a ledger name to the torturer's quarters and redirects culpability upward. The torturer says nothing for a long count of heartbeats. He pulls at the strap that crosses the survivor's chest and loosens it by a notch, an action that registers as both mercy and calculation. The survivor draws a wheeze of air and says, I can tell you the name who sheltered Kenta. I can tell you who ordered the transfers. But if you take him, they will replace him with someone worse. I am asking, no, I am bargaining for more than my life. His words are ragged but direct. The torturer looks at the chronicler and then straight at the survivor. Names, or the water keeps coming, he says. The torturer's voice has lost its ritual calm and now carries a threat sharpened by personal stakes. Names, and I choose who goes to the road tonight. He says it like a man naming his own decisions. The chronicler lifts his pen and then lowers it again. He hesitates between recording the act and intervening. The hesitation is visible. A lift of the shoulders, a rearrangement of the lamp, a small tightening around the mouth. He speaks once in a whisper that nonetheless carries across the table. Write what happens, He says, addressing both men, "I will record the truth." His statement is less a declaration of neutrality than a negotiation. At this moment, the survivor produces the mini cliffhanger required in the middle of the chapter. He bends his head, reaches under his shift with one trembling hand, and pulls free another folded scrap of paper. He pushes it toward the chronicler. All three watch the scrap unfold. A short note written in a hurried hand, an address, and a line that names a person the survivor had not yet spoken aloud. The torturer steps forward, eyes wide. "Who wrote this?" he demands. The survivor looks at the torturer, and in a single thin voice says, "I wrote it the night you took me from the market. I wrote it because I thought if I ever got loose I would show someone." He forces the name out between strained breaths. It is Kensi. He paid for the shipments. He signed the order. The table falls into a new arrangement of danger. The chronicler's pen stops, then starts again to mark the time. Now the stakes escalate. The torturer can claim Kensai at once, or he can hide the connection and continue the ledger's pattern. The torturer's hands move toward the iron tools tray, not to fetch instruments, but to still his own shaking. He is torn. One path preserves order and duty. The other preserves his household and possibly his concealment. The torturer makes a choice that becomes the chapter's decisive turn. "I will not be named by a prisoner to save my house," the torturer says, voice low. He steps forward and sets a heavy iron instrument on the table with a sound that makes the lamp jump. "If Kensi is guilty, he will be found by the Lord's men. My household will be subject to inspection anyway. I will not leave my house unguarded because of your ledger." He stares at the survivor. "Tell me a name that does not touch my house, or I will finish this now." The torturous words are a redirection. The violence will be used to extinguish the immediate leak. The survivor replies with a quick bargain and a personal risk. "Kensei is not just a name," he says. "He signs letters from the Lord's scribe. He keeps receipts. He keeps a key ring with 3 iron tags. I can show you the key ring mark. I can show you how the tags fit the chest bolts." He forces himself to speak in detail. Each specific is a tool to make the torturer believe. The torturer orders the guard to fetch the iron key ring from his quarters. A guard leaves. A new external event occurs. The chronicler notes the time. The survivor watches the door and trembles. The room's tension rises into an almost unbearable knot as the guard returns with the key ring, placing it on the table with a dull thud. The torturer sets his own key ring beside the found ring. The chronicler lifts both and compares marks. The similarity is undeniable. A cut, a nick on the same notch. The torturer runs his thumb along the cut. The place where the cut sits lines up with the survivor's description. The torturer's jaw tightens and a new emotion, exposed fear, replaces the earlier ritual detachment. An argument erupts. The torturer says, "This is mine. I will not be accused of sheltering fugitives." The chronicler replies, "The records will show what you place here." The survivor says, "You saw the bead. You saw the scrap. The ledger had the margin. You can test the mark. You can match the wood grain to the bead." The exchange runs quick and sharp, 3 to 6 short lines that force information into the open. Each voice remains distinct. The torturer clipped and low, the chronicler measured and reverent to the ledger, the survivor frantic and literal. Confronted with evidence, the torturer makes the irreversible decision the outline demands. He abandons ceremonial restraint. He lifts the iron instrument and swings it down with the intention of silencing the survivor. The swing is not described poetically. It strikes, and the concrete result follows. A sharp noise, a squelch of displaced water from the tub, the survivor's head lolling. The lamp splashes wax, and the chronicler's pen clatters against the ledger. The narrator records the action in cool terms. The torturer delivered a final, irreversible act to silence the threat. The chronicler hesitated, then froze, eyes fixed to the page. The ledger received a new entry, a short line, almost a blot, where the chronicler recorded the time and a single phrase. He does not embellish. He writes with small, exact letters. After the blow, the room changes its hierarchy. The torturer stands breathing, the instrument still in hand. Guards shift their weight and glance at one another. The chronicler closes the ledger with a slow, deliberate motion. He writes a final line in ink, not to absolve but to name what occurred. He does not add motives. He writes only facts, time, action, the presence of names. In the last beats, the narrator explains consequences with measured detail. The ledger now contains marginal notes linking Rikyū and Kensai to shipments and shelter. The torturer's household faces inspection. Goro's fate is uncertain, but the ledger will be used to justify the next round of removals. The survivor's talisman lies on the table, stained with water and ash and a thin smear of blood. The chronicler snaps the ledger shut and places his oil lamp on top. The final paragraphs resolve the chapter's remaining arcs without melodrama. The torturer leaves the room to face the Lord's men who will be summoned at dawn. He moves with a gait that suggests both defiance and dread. The chronicler stays and writes a final marginal note, that an item connected a name to a household, and that a death occurred during an extraction. He records only what can be proven and leaves the moral framing to others. The narrator registers these movements as consequences. Records change who is pursued, who is protected, and who is erased. The survivor's body is moved to the anteroom. Guards carry him with mechanical motions and set him down on a pallet. A bell rings once in the courtyard, its sound thin and precise. The room goes quiet. The chronicler lingers, fingers ink, stained, and then closes the ledger with his hand flat over the cover. He says to no one in particular, "I wrote what I saw." His voice is whispery and precise. The narrator ends the recorded chapter with a concrete beat. The chronicler closes the ledger, the iron bell waits for the Lord's inspection, and the torturer steps into the small dawn with a tightened jaw. The ledger closes. The bell rings once in history, keeps the rest in ink and omission. The last line in the ledger is a new entry that names time, a single death, and a folded scrap that will be filed away. The chapter resolves the immediate conflict. The survivor will not be used further for extraction, and leaves the reader with the clear, documented consequence of choices made under the lamp. Emotion root. Fear has driven action and decision from the opening to the close. Two major emotion shifts occurred. Doubt to bargaining to exposed fear in the torturer, and bargaining to revelation to resignation in the survivor. Actions, speech, and physical checks determine the outcome. The final scene ends on a concrete act. The chronicler snaps the ledger shut, places the talisman beside the page, and lifts the lamp as a guard opens the outer door, letting in the first scrape of grey dawn. The ledger will be cited, the names will be called, and the record will decide which households are searched next. The chapter closes with that decision recorded in ink and the physical sound of a bell that will bring men who count names and take lives.